I'm excited to introduce Dave Redekopp. And everybody knows him well. He is one of our pioneers, right? Even though he looks really young, but he's one of our pioneers. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but he is the president of the Life Role Development Group, and Dave has been an enthusiastic member of career development 30 years. He particularly loves the variety in this work. He teaches, research, consulting, writing, counseling, coaching, program development, facilitating, presenting. I don't know how he does it all. So today he's going to talk to us about research on the connections between work and mental health, as well as career development and mental health. And he's going to create questions and look at relationships in both employment, career development, and knowledge in regards to our mental health. So let's give a big hand for Dr. Dave Redekopp.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a great lunch. Hope you're having a great conference. I need to tell you a little bit about my learning style because it will explain this talk. I love learning, and I would have been a lifetime student if I would have been allowed. But I wasn't. And I have, unfortunately, a very limited attention span. And so what happens is I only really learn if I'm pressed to. There's a deadline, there's some urgency, there's something I need to do. So for those of you who know behavioral economics, you'll know there's kind of self one and self two. And self two is that, and I always get them mixed up, but you know, one of the selves is that rational, planful, self that you know looks after your best interests over the long term, and the other self is the one that's kind of impulsive and looking at kiddie videos on the internet when you're supposed to be writing a report, and that self dominates my life unless I do something, and so what I do typically is I will set up pressure events to ensure that I learn. So a while ago, I got a call, and I was asked, do you want to be a keynote for a conference? And it's a Canadian, whatever they're called, Psychotherapy, Counselor and Psychotherapy Association. I thought that'd be fantastic, right? And they said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, give me a moment. And I thought, what do I need to learn about? Because this will create some pressure, won't it? And so I said, career development and mental health. I think it's super important. Now, they took that as that I knew something about it. Those are two different terms, right? And anyway, so I've been learning since about career development and mental health because the CCPA conference is coming up in 2 weeks. And guess what? It's big. It's a big topic. So here's what's going to happen. Because you're not psychotherapists and counselors in that sense, I'm not giving you exactly that talk. But you know when you get into something and it looks really simple, like when my daughter got into Irish dance, I thought, well, what is it? Funny costume, you dance, you don't move your arms a lot. What, like how hard is that? But of course you get into it and you find out, oh, it's like a cult, right? It's like it's an industry. There's people who, sell different kinds of Irish dance shoes and these wigs that you have to buy and oh, it's just endless. Like there's this entire industry and you get into it and you realize it's overwhelming. But then after a while you get used to it and all of a sudden it seems simple again. Well, I'm still in the thick of it when it comes to career development and mental health, work and mental health, because it's big, it's very big. And I still think it's absurdly important. And in fact, the more I look at this area, the more I think somebody, as in all of us, need to start thinking about this seriously. Because as I mentioned, I think yesterday in some talk, the money, the resources, the attention in Canada right now is focused towards mental health. There is money for it, right? We have Bell doing the Let's Talk Day. It's Mental Health Week this week. Nationally, we have RBC has put tons of money into it. It's a big thing. People are interested in it. And what we haven't done as a community is show what's our piece of it as career development practitioners. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. And the other piece that, just fair warning, I not only need your help, I'm extremely open to your help, right? So what you will find is I will talk about things, and then you'll go, but you've missed this entire body of research. And you're probably right. I missed it. Like I'll explain this later, but there are these streams of research that don't talk to each other. And I might have missed a stream. But every time I look around, I find this new stream. I go, who would have thought of that? But I pursue it, and off we go. So I'm going to talk about work and mental health. I'm going to talk about career development and mental health. And you'll see in a moment that the lens with which I'm going to take a look at this. And by the way, you can't derail my train of thought because there's no track, really. And so if you have a question, like this is not a keynote, this is a session, it's just unfortunate I'm sort of tied to a mic. But if you have a question or a comment or whatever, just have at it. And if I'm going too fast, too slow, or whatever, let me know as well. So quick overview, and we're going to get into it. The first thing I want to do is set the stage around some clarity just around terms, right? And the first set will be around mental health versus mental illness, and a little bit about the nuances of career development. And then we can look at, well, okay, so what does work do or working do for mental illness and for mental health? Or the absence of work, what happens then to mental illness and mental health? But then I want to also then take a look at, okay, let's take a look at career development more broadly, and what are the implications of having intentional career development practice on mental health and mental illness, and then figure out, okay, so what do we do about this? Like, what do we as a field do with kind of the findings or the lack of findings that are out there? Now, fair warning, it looks kind of simple, but like Irish dance, it gets a bit complicated. There's lots of variables, folks, lots and lots. And clearly, this diagram sums it all up. And we'll just go through this. Actually, you know what this is? Has nothing to do with mental health. I just loved it. It's from the Dog Genome Project of the National Institutes of Health in the U.S. And you got to love that graphic. You also got to love that the National Institutes of Health, which is a human health institute, has identified the 23 dog genomes in the world and all the breeds, and they're missing about 12 breeds now, I think. But isn't that a lovely graphic? Like, if you're going to do science, you might as well make it beautiful, right? And but here's the interesting thing. What this thing does is show you how all dog breeds are related to other dog breeds and which ones are closer to others, and then where there's snippets of connections, which is the lines going across and the colored lines. This is kind of like mental illness, mental health, and career development. It's complicated, folks. There's lots of interacting variables, and I will try and make it look simple, and then deep down you have to recognize this isn't simple. It's complicated. So let's get to it. And I'm going to start with the real basics. Mental illness. Mental illness and a definition from the Public Health Agency of Canada. So, mental illnesses are characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, or behavior associated with significant distress and impaired functioning. And so we can relate to that. The important part, which I'll talk more about later, is the next bullet. Mental illness is not the same as the absence of mental health. And in fact, one can argue they're on different dimensions. And I will argue that in a minute. That it's super important to look at mental illness, and there's lots of implications of working and not working with regards to mental illness. That won't be the emphasis of what I'm talking about today. I want to look at mental health, but I will touch on that so at least you know where to look. So when you think about mental illnesses, this can range, right? This can range from a phobia, that's considered a mental illness in the DSM-5, or anxiety, and we've been talking about anxiety at this conference for various reasons, all the way to the sort of major difficulties that people have. But if we go to mental health, and again, go to the Public Health Agency of Canada, Here we have to feel, to think, to act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy and deal with the challenges we face, to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. A positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. It's actually a fairly political kind of statement of mental health in the Public Health Agency. If you look at the World Health Organization, it's a little less political. They don't talk about equity and social justice, but they have a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, of course, as career development people, you're already going, well, we're seeing career development written all over these things, right? The idea of contribution, the idea of realizing potential. But the average Canadian doesn't necessarily see it that way, I would argue. And we'll talk about that a bit more. And notice, too, there's kind of these big distinctions, right? It's not just about enjoying life. That's part of, mental health. There is that bigger picture of well-being, and that includes things like contribution and making a difference and being fruitful, whatever that means to the World Health Organization, right? And so when we think about, mental health, we're not just thinking about the happy life. We're thinking about the good life. We're thinking about the meaningful life as well. And so we have a model, and I've got a picture of Mark Slomp there. Mark Slomp is the Director of Student Services. Dr. Mark Slomp was the Director of Student Services for the University of Lethbridge. And shortly after I hung up on the phone call saying, yes, I'd give this talk on career development and mental health, I sent out an email to a few people who I knew would know something about it. He immediately responded and said, look no further. Go to Corey Keyes, just follow him, you're fine. Well, I, of course, ignored that and read a million other things and then came back to Corey Keyes because I think Mark is right. Corey Keyes is a positive psychologist, if that's such a thing, but, with those folks like Martin Seligman and those types of people, who at some point created this model back in the 80s, and it's widely used in the U.S., and I think a little bit used here, but widely used in the U.S., and reasonably well-researched model, where the idea is, let's see mental health coexisting with mental illness. Oh, by the way, one more thing, and I just noticed, thank you for taking that picture. You can take pictures all you want, but even better, this will all get posted on the conference site. And one of the things, getting back to my this gets complicated slide, there's lots of data underneath what I'm talking about, and I've tried to be pretty good about references, so when you go to the notes section of the PowerPoint, you can go to the articles that are supporting it. Even the Dog Genome Project, the reference is there. It's a very cool site, folks. Sorry. So for Corey Keyes, the idea was, what if they're on two dimensions? What if you could be mentally ill, right, have a mental illness, like a phobia, like anxiety, whatever, and be mentally healthy, like actually, get stuff done in the world and feel good for lots of the day and be productive and feel like you're a contributing part of the world. And so he put them on two dimensions where as we move up the mental health scale, Corey Keyes calls that flourishing. And as you move down the mental health scale, so that's the vertical one, we call that languishing if you're not very strong on the mental health front. But you can languish and not have a mental illness. And you can flourish with a mental illness. And this is kind of nice because for any of you who've ever been diagnosed with something, that kind of labeling can get pretty strange, pretty restricting, and pretty self-fulfilling, I would think. And on a simple example, again, we were talking at lunch about how it just seems so many young people have anxiety now, particularly young women. And what's interesting about many young women I know who have been officially and formally diagnosed with anxiety is most of the rest of the world wouldn't know it. They're doing just fine. They function. Their parents know it. Their siblings might know it. Their best friends know it. but they can actually go out in the world and they can get a whole bunch of stuff done. They go home and they feel terrible and they have stomach aches and they puke and all that stuff. But there's both going on. There's this terrible, terrible anxiety that is a mental illness, and there's the ability to go do things and flourish, right? And it's kind of nice that we can look at both of those in this model. Now, just for terminology's sake, no, you know what? I'll save that for the next slide, I think. So, but this makes sense, I hope, right? That you could have a phobia and still be, pretty together. You can have anxiety. You can have, in fact, depression. And but again, for large parts of the day, be out there, be looking normal, actually feeling pretty good about things until you stop, right? And then you realize, holy cow, am I depressed? And I have been there. I kind of know what that's like. So, by the way, for those of you who are into, how many people here kind of follow positive psychology? The Martin Seligmans of the world. Seligman has a book called Flourish. And for reasons completely unknown to me, it was written long after Keyes wrote about flourishing. And Seligman and Keyes worked together, and I'm assuming they had a little spat, because Keyes gets like 2 sentences of reference in this entire book on flourishing, right? And Seligman's version isn't that different. So I don't know what happened there, but if you're a Seligman fan, he talks about, you've got the happy life, and then you've got I wrote it down somewhere, the happy life, the pleasant life, right? The good life and the meaningful life. And Keyes makes a slightly different distinction where there's 2 parts to mental health, which we'll get to. And we're there. So one part is around what he calls hedonic well-being, as in hedonistic. Just you feel good, right? Your emotional well-being, right? You feel positive affect, you're happy, you're kind of satisfied with life. That's certainly a part of mental health, and any definition of mental health will have that in there. Where it gets a little more interesting is what he calls eudaimonic well-being, and there's not the only model of that, but the thing comes from Aristotle originally, but this idea of daemons, and a daemon is your kind of inner potential. It's that kind of Maslow idea of self-actualizing, that there's something in you that wants to grow up to be it, and if you allow that to emerge, that's eudaimonic well-being. And there's 2 parts to that in Corey Keyes' model. And one part is that it isn't just about you, all right? It's not just about you. That full mental health, full flourishing has a huge social component. So it's not that you just feel good, the psychological, and it's not, or the emotional. It's that in your social world, you feel social acceptance, that you're not sticking out like a sore thumb, that you fit in, that you kind of know your place. Social actualization, this idea of, it's a weird thing, but it's kind of confidence in your society's ability to carry on and create a future. And think society later in terms of, say, a work organization, right? Like how different it is when you're in a society, like a work organization, that doesn't look like it knows where it's going, and how weird that feels, compared to being in an organization that has systems and structures and a vision and direction and strategy, and how much more comforting that is. And then expand that with countries, right? So if you're in a society that's in total chaos, Sierra Leone, for example, there's a worldwide trust index, for example, and trust is one of the biggest predictors of economic growth. And you look at the trust indicators worldwide, and like Sierra Leone constantly is at the bottom, where nobody trusts anybody, and nor should they, right? Nobody trusts government, nobody trusts their neighbors, it is just unbelievably low. By the way, just a little trivia for you, Canada is reasonably high, and England is not. It's so interesting. England is one of those places where it's an outlier statistically, because they do quite well economically, but man, not a lot of trust there. Social contribution. And here's the idea of, there's a common good, right? That somehow we're all, we're contributing to something that's bigger than us. Social coherence is another factor in eudaimonic well-being. And social integration. And social integration is this bigger picture of acceptance where not only do I fit in, but actually everybody fits in, and we actually work at this, right? We actually work at becoming a thing, like a social organism. Now, on the psychological side of flourishing or mental health, we have some of the obvious ones that would come to mind for you, right? Self-acceptance, right? Like I'm not going to bed at night hating myself. Personal growth, that I haven't stagnated. There's purpose in life. There's something outside me drawing me forward. Environmental mastery, right? That I can get stuff done, right? That I have some control over my environment. Autonomy, that I can make some choices, right? And I'm not always being told what to do. And positive relations with others, right? That there's some connection there. Now, and again, whenever you think about this from career development terms and from mental health terms, the middle ground between society and the individual, in a lot of cases, is the organization, right? And for me, that's where you can really start looking at this stuff in detail, right? If you take an organization that somebody works for and you call that a society, then you can start seeing, okay, so where are the implications for mental health? Now, by the way, just back to Seligman for a moment, he has this thing called PERMA. Instead of this list, he has positive emotion is the P in PERMA, engagement, relationships, meaning, which is purpose, and achievement. And anyway, there's other models, but I won't get into that. But now, let me just go back here. When you think about mental health, this is what we're aiming for, folks, when we go to career development. Emotional well-being, are we helping people with positive affect, happiness, and life satisfaction? Social well-being and all those social attributes, and then psychological well-being, all three. And if we have all three, we've got flourishing or mental health. All right. So let's start looking at some of these relationships. First of all, okay, and now another picture of this gal is Christine Boychuk, who I believe has now Dr. Boychuk. But when I contacted her, she was a PhD student in rehab at Queen's University, and again, back to my learning style, I do learn better from others than from just abstract stuff. So I did some quick search, and she had published something about mental health and illness, so I sent her a note. I said, what can you tell me? I'm desperate. And man, minutes later, I get like 32 Adobe attachments with all these articles on mental illness, mental health. I think this gal's great. And what she studies, and what her dissertation's about, is particularly youth with mental illness, diagnosed with mental illness, and the kind of difficulties they face trying to get work. So let me talk a little bit about work and mental illness, starting with, because it goes both ways, right? If you have a mental illness, it's incredibly difficult to find work. And if you have bad work or you lose work, you are more susceptible to a mental illness. So let me start with, you have a mental illness, and now you want to find work. And here's what we know, very little. Like, we know that it's hard. We know that there are endless difficulties with people with mental illness finding work. And I can just give you some examples. But before I do that, what's interesting, and this is pretty recent research, is like somebody did a meta-analysis of all the studies on this and said almost nothing is known at all conclusively about what kind of programming works for people with mental illness to get them working. Which is kind of sad because there's lots of research. But it's a lot of either kind of average research, it's not really rigorous, or it's kind of one-off research. Nobody's actually validated, what somebody claimed, or it's with different populations, et cetera. That just doesn't give us a lot of confidence in what we're finding. And surprisingly, the only thing that seems to show some reliable evidence is something called individualized placement and support, IPS. Now, how many have ever heard that term before? Okay. Now, I first heard of it years ago, and it was, to me, it was quite revolutionary. It was this idea. What it is you don't worry about, all the stuff you have to do from a career development perspective to get somebody ready for work. You just get them working. And then once they're working, then you give them support. And then you do those things that they need. And I had seen evidence for this years ago, and not just for mental illness, for anybody who was unemployed. Just get them working and then deal with it. And we're going to get to this. What does working do for you, right? Well, it builds up your confidence. It helps you see the world differently. It helps you better make use of all the interventions that you can't make use of when you're not working, right? So that one kind of makes some sense. But it's this idea of place, then place the person, then train them. Go ahead, Emily. Elaborate, please, and I will repeat because I know people can't hear you.
That's like housing first as an approach. Helping a homeless person get into housing and then dealing with the issues that make them homeless.
Right. Yeah, like deal with those basic needs, right? Housing first is the one Emily's dealing with. Having a sense of place is what putting somebody to work deals with. A sense of, you deal with all these things right away as soon as they're working, right? A sense of place, a sense of community, a sense of purpose. It's kind of nice. So we know that much, but it's remarkably little. And I have not read Dr. Boychuk's dissertation yet, but she was looking at trying to get more systematic about the evaluation of this stuff so that we could say this works, right? And if you have a kid particularly kids with mental illness, you could do certain things. But what she talks about as well, and if you're ever on that Contact Point website, you can find a little thing she wrote about cultural scripts. That we have so many belief systems in our society about mental illness that constrain what can happen, right? So that we have these beliefs that if you're mentally ill, well, there's something wrong with your motivation, and if you just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you'd be fine, and there's some character weakness to you, and so not only do you have a mental illness, which is a problem enough, you're going into a system that has all these sorts of beliefs about you, and that creates a whole bunch of new problems as well, right? And those are called cultural scripts, and certainly in Canada and most countries we have these cultural scripts about mental illness, that, and not just mental illness, about anything, right? If you're overweight, well, you should just eat less, have some discipline, eh? And these sorts of attitudes and cultural scripts really kind of prevent what is already a difficult thing from being successful. So here's just some things we know about, say, young people with mental illness, right? Post-secondary completion is significantly lower. Career identity is considerably weaker. Their decision-making competence is less than a population of non-mentally ill youth. And they have, perceptions of fewer options than the average youth. So they're starting from not a great place. And because they're starting from not a great place, and they're doing that in youth during these developmental periods when it's important for that to happen, it tends never to happen, right? It's not encouraging. And, when you look at the stats, and like StatsCan just put a tweet out two days ago saying 1 out of 6 Canadians sought treatment for mental health last year. And the other more general stat is 1 out of 5 Canadians have sought treatment for mental health within the last X number of years, and I don't remember what X is. So we've got this big chunk of population that is bumping into problems, and then they've got their own problems, and then we add problems by having these cultural scripts about how we think they got there and what they should do about it and that sort of thing. Okay, so let's look at the other direction. We know it's hard to get work if you have a mental illness, but what's the effect of work on mental illness? And well, we've got lots of stuff here, right? That there's lots of strong evidence. In fact, one study, a meta-analysis I read, went, just stop already. We don't have to study this anymore. We know that when people are unemployed, it's harmful to health, physical health. I mean, like heart problems go up, all sorts of physical things happen, but including poor mental health, psychological distress, minor psychological and psychiatric morbidity. This is quite well known. And we also know that reemployment leads to, improved self-esteem, general health, physical health and mental health, reduced psychological distress, minor psychiatric morbidity. And again, this meta-analysis endorsed the assumption that unemployment is not only correlated to distress, it's causal. So losing your job is causal. In fact, it's not in here, but I read a study a few years ago at a UBC, oddly enough, that showed that, on a satisfaction index, your life satisfaction would go down 3 times more losing your job but still having the same income than it would losing a third of your income. So it's got that big a difference. Like, imagine losing a third of your income. You'd be a little distressed tomorrow, but that isn't, you'd be way more distressed having the same income but losing your job.
One of the biggest markers that I noticed, and I'm sure a lot of other people did, was just after the crash of the oil prices, crime rates exploded.
Yeah.
Whether it's domestic violence, that was drug-related crime, domestic violence.
Right.
They all just went right through the roof.
Right. Now, you wouldn't have heard that, but the comment was what's exploded with the oil crisis, the economic crisis in Alberta, is the crime rates have changed completely. And of course, the types of crime, right? It's not, just credit card theft went up. No. Domestic violence. It's people hurting each other who are close to them, and addictions and substance abuse types of issues have gone up. I mean, other types of crime have too, but not at the same level. We just know it's a problem, right?
It's interesting, in Calgary, working with people who lost their jobs, so their mental health has gone down. They're offered a job, it's at half the rate of what they were earning, and they're refusing it. And not seeing that working, and so that's been a challenge, I think, for us in counseling, and to say, like, get out there, but
Yeah.
no, I'm worth more, I'm not going to take it.
Yeah. Well, and there is such an interesting psychology around that when you're removed from it, it's very easy to see it, right? I used to teach a lot of police, like a lot of police across the country, and just for fun, but also to prove this point you're making. I would, go into a group of RCMP and go, so you heard the news, eh? And they go, what news? Well, Edmonton police, they're now making 20% more than you are. Oh man, these people would just fall into depression. They were perfectly happy at coffee, and now they're depressed. And why? It's just a comparative, right? It is just, I'm not in the place I think I should be, and therefore it's terrible, right? So you see that as the outside. Now, as soon as you're there, we know the data is you'd rather be working and making less. We know that, but it's so hard to see it when you're in it, right? It's so hard to see it. All right. So it's sort of, really, really obvious that work can play a really positive role in mental health, and a really destructive role can be played by unemployment. There's a caveat, though, and the caveat is that it's good work. Because all of you know somebody who's been destroyed by their workplace, right? And where the workplace has created mental health problems, and not only created mental health problems, has probably created mental illness. And so I don't want to paint this perfectly rosy picture of everything. This can go both ways. And this, again, is part of that complicated piece where it does depend on the employer. It does depend on how the work is structured, and again, on both sides, the mental illness side and the mental health side. You know, I got to tell you a quick story because it's lovely, and it is semi-public. I have a neighbor whose daughter is anorexic, and that's actually, I've already blown it. A daughter who has anorexia, right? That's not her, but she has anorexia. Anorexia is, and I didn't know this till my neighbor whose daughter has anorexia became the ED of the Eating Disorder Support Network of Alberta. Eating Disorder Support Network of Alberta. I didn't know it's the most lethal of all the mental illnesses. 1 out of 10 people with anorexia will die of it. It's quite staggering, actually. So here's this girl, lovely girl, has anorexia. She gets treatment. You know, we have a fantastic treatment center at U of A. Make a long story short, she gets quite a bit better, but you never know with something like that, right? So she goes, she finishes high school, but this is like after 3 years, right? And I'm not telling tales out of school. There's a book about this. Anyway, she's just doing well. Everybody thinks she's doing well. It's fantastic. She's out of school. She's finally an adult. She's still living at home, but she's working. And then things go south. But, fairly gradually. But at some point she realizes, hang on, I'm in trouble here. But she's got 2 jobs. And, of course, what's her biggest worry? Telling her employers. So she realizes she has to check herself back into the hospital. She just can't do this on her own. And she can't do it with her mom and dad, who are incredibly supportive. She has to get back into this hospital. But she doesn't want to tell her employers because she's hoping she'll be able to work again. So she is going to leave. One's with the coffee shop, one's with this. She's a receptionist for this office, a tattoo shop, actually. And for whatever reason, this employer at the tattoo shop, full of tattoos, big burly guy, he says, so you need a month off, eh? He said, that's kind of abrupt. He says, my guess is something big's going on here. And he said, I want you to deal with it. And if you ever want to talk to me about whatever it is, let me know. And she thinks, holy cow, wasn't expecting that from this guy. So she tells him what's going on. He said, oh, okay, get your ass out of here. Get yourself checked in. And the next day it comes, he knows she likes to draw, comes with this portfolio. Comes with a portfolio where she can draw, and he has, for the whatever number of days she's expected to be gone, written a little word of encouragement in every corner. Like, this is a guy who's changing mental health, right? And who's also helping this kid deal with mental illness. She knows she's got somewhere to be back. It turns out she did so well in 2 weeks, they said, you could work part-time. He said, we'll just clear the decks. You have a job, right? I mean, a great employer can do amazing things. A terrible employer can do terrible things. So keep that in mind. So having said that, let's look at Peter Ward's vitamins. Now, this is interesting, right? There's so many people who do career development stuff who don't call themselves career development people. And this guy's in England somewhere, and he works for some Warwick, maybe? I don't know, but some university that looks at work. And he's got these vitamins. And he says these are the things that work gives you. Opportunity for personal control, opportunity for skill use and acquisition. You're going to see some overlap, right, between Corey Key's stuff. Externally generated goals. Now think about this. I never thought about it in these terms, but it is actually helpful for humans to have goals that are set by somebody else, which is interesting. I didn't know that until I was reading this. Variety, right? That workplaces give you variety. Environmental clarity. In a good workplace, you know what you're dealing with, right? You know what's in, you know what's out, you know the rules, right? Contact with others. Availability of money is always a helpful thing. Physical security, that you feel safe at a workplace, hopefully. You have a valued social position. And then the 3 italicized ones, they're italicized because these are 3 that you get only at work. Supportive supervision, a career outlook, like some sort of pathway that you can see, and equity, that the rules of fairness are clear. But notice, all these other ones, which will happen at work, can happen anywhere, depending on what your role is. So start thinking about this in terms of community work, in terms of being a parent, in terms of being a spouse, in terms of all those other roles that you play. All right, so we've got now, we've got a lot of stuff here. We've got these psychological, social well-being elements. We've got things that and all of these are backed up by research. That's the fabulous thing about War's work. This guy's a bright guy, by the way. You guys take notes. He's done some other stuff that's fantastic. I've never heard of him. But anyway, so we've got this list of things that is well researched in terms of what work creates. And now we have to talk about career development, right? Because all I talked about so far is work. And they're different things. And this is a problem. That when most, Joe Public thinks about career development, what do they think about? Work. That you're going to help, if you do career stuff, you must be helping people get work. And it kind of stops there, right? And we got to get past that. So in the and I'm going to go really quickly because this is your field, right? In the standard guidelines, right? What's the definition? Career development is the lifelong process, so well before you start work, of managing learning, not work, learning, work, leisure, and transitions in order to move toward a personally determined and evolving preferred future. It's a process, folks, and hopefully it's an intentional process. And work is only a little part of that. And I think, to me, what's important is that managing, the word managing in here might be the way more important part of the definition than work. That career development's about managing all this stuff. And so I'm going to do this super quick. In fact, I'm going to just get rid of all these animations. And it's just to set the stage for something. So let's just take a look at career development in a very broad sense, right? If you start thinking, and it doesn't matter how old you are, when, what you're doing, you just start thinking about, oh, what do I want to do with my life? One of the things hopefully you're thinking about is, well, what do I got so far? Right? What kind of skills? Where am I at? What kind of skills? What kind of assets? What kind of strengths do I have? What weaknesses do I have? What issues do I have? Right? You figure out, the lay of the land, both environmentally and personally. And no matter where you are in life, whether you're in grade 3 thinking about grade 4, or you're an executive who's just lost your job in Calgary and want to get one again, hopefully you're always thinking about, boy, if everything went right, what would life be like? Right? If everything went right, what would life be like? That idea of a preferred future, a vision, this cloudy sense of, okay, I kind of know what my dreams are about. And then, of course, where it gets complicated is everything in between, right? We all know where we are in the map of life, sort of, and we all have this sense of where we want to go. That's why we buy lottery tickets. And where we run into trouble is the in-between. How do we start moving in the right direction? And there is this public perception that, well, you just get to know yourself, understand the labor market, make a match, and, if you're destined to be an engineer, go for it and you'll be fine. You're destined to be a teacher, go for it and you'll be fine. Whatever. And there is still that mentality of take a test, it'll tell you what to do, that sort of thing. Now, when you scratch the surface a bit, parents and kids and adults will go, yeah, okay, it's not quite that simple. But what we know is that it's actually a very strategic process, and it's a rolling strategy. It's a strategy that's changing with every move you make, right? So you know what your assets are, you've got a vision, and the only thing that connects those two things is your heart, right? What's important to you? And what's fun or enjoyable for you, right? Those are the only things that will be true at both points in time, right? And everything else in the middle is in flux. And so what do? Well, you try and set some midterm goals for yourself in the context of all sorts of trends, some of which Serena was talking about this morning, right? You realize, hang on, the world's changing. There's lots of winds of change. But I want to go in this direction. how do I start setting up some midterm goals that will move me closer to my preferred future? Knowing, though, that at the end of the day, what can I control? Just the short term. That's all I can do. And then once I've met my short-term goals, I'm going to have to regroup and do it all over again. And that's why it's a rolling strategy. It's not a permanent or a fixed strategy. Now, if we start seeing career development this way, and I know you folks already do, what we start seeing are some things that will take us back to mental health, right? Things like agency and control. Because the point of this diagram is that the person whose career is developing is in charge of it. They're the ones determining their preferred future. They're the ones identifying their own assets. They're the ones setting goals. It is an agency-based model, a control and autonomy kind of model. We also see in a model like this that you need some skills to make this happen. This is a competence-based model. It's not an event that you need in the modern world as a Canadian to be strategic about what's going on, to read the newspapers occasionally, to talk to your colleagues about where the world of work is going, to find out about these winds of change. You need the skills of strategy, of self-awareness, of self-reflection, those sorts of things. And we also know that this is not just with regards to work. So if you look at vision, you'll see there's lifestyle up there. You'll see there's location up there. There's activities and there's relationships, and nowhere is there the word work. Because all of this can happen without working if you do win the lottery. Because guess what? If you win the lottery, you still want to do this stuff. You just don't have to worry about the funds attached to it, right? So it's about all roles. It's about skills. It's about strategy. And it's about agency and control. And it's about all of these things that get us back to mental health. Now, back to the general public, you know, if you think about super simple logic model for career development, right? You got inputs and processes and outcomes. Most clients coming to us, I think, still expect that, well, you'll figure out something about my personality and my strengths, you know, whether that's IQ or socioeconomic status or gender or whatever. You'll do this kind of assessment with me, and we'll compare that, and then we'll do a bunch of planning, make some decisions. You know, maybe I'll have to learn something, then I'll go hunt for a job, and you're going to help me with that, and then I'll achieve. It'll be great. And then I'll get these outcomes. Meaningful work being hopefully the first one. And it sounds really simple. And then you think, well, okay, maybe I'll get a desired lifestyle too, and maybe I'll get some skills, and maybe I'll, you know, start feeling more skillful, that idea of efficacy, and maybe I'll feel a bit more part of society. But most clients come to us because they want work. And what we have to work on with them, of course, and the general public, is this idea of enhanced skills becomes a new input, right? And this is the career development part. That if we're doing our jobs right as career practitioners, we're not writing resumes for people, we're not going to their interviews for them, we're not doing their assessments for them. We're helping them learn the skills of being self-reflective, of assessing, of articulating their own strengths, all those sorts of things that we do in career development. And it's those skills that then that roll back and allow them to be better at the next transition that they're doing. The next transition, hopefully, that they're instigating rather than responding to, right? Because they do have more efficacy, they do have more skills. So let's see if this works. Oh, you can actually plug. Sorry, on my screen I can barely read it, but on your screen, can you read that? Fantastic. So rather than a logic model, I'm thinking what we need somehow, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is how do we communicate what we do so that we can make those mental health links to career development, not just work? Because I would argue when we do good career development, even if the person doesn't get work, we're still helping with their mental health, right? And that you can get work and still have not great mental health because you haven't also done some really good career development around it. So I'm looking for a way, and this is where I need your help, looking for a way to articulate What else happens here? So we have a career development intervention, right? The gray circle up there. And that leads to some pretty direct outcomes, right? You got me work and I now have an income. And people get that. That's pretty clear. That's why they come to us. But what we don't communicate well, I don't think, is that there's another set of outcomes around their competence. That we are helping them learn the skills they need to manage their lives, to manage their career paths, to manage their transitions. And that in learning those skills, we are actually helping them change their outlook, both inward and outward. Right? That when you're skilled up, and particularly when you're in an environment where you get to use those skills, work, then your outlook changes, right? And all of you know this, if you've ever been unemployed, you know, you just walk around like, oh, it's just terrible, right? And then, you know, a few hours after being employed, it's going, that wasn't so bad, I'm fine, right? I've been there too, where, you know, smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day while I was unemployed. And I'd only been unemployed for like 2 weeks. And I just thought life was going to end. And of course, the first hour into employment, I'm going, oh, wonder what I was stressed about. Like, I mean, I was young, right? I was stupid. But negate that. It's still, you know, that emotional experience. Your outlook changes when you have skills and you know it. You have skills to manage your own life. You have an ability. And there's 3 things. The slide only shows 2. Under that, there's efficacy, right? Your sense of, yeah, I can get stuff done changes. And that's an inner outlook. But your hope changes. Your sense of, hang on, yeah, no matter what happens, I'll be okay. That changes. And it is about, not necessarily about expecting the outer world to be different, but seeing the outside world differently from that perspective. And the third thing that should be on this is identity, right? That when you have skills, and if you combine those skills with work, you start feeling a structure of who you are, right? That you become self-definitional, if that's a word, and it probably isn't. But this idea of, yeah, okay, this is me. You know, I've got this sense. And, you know, I used to be a mechanic years ago when I was a kid, and it's the goofiest thing putting on a uniform. It is the goofiest thing, because it changes you. And I would put on my uniform in the morning, and I was a different guy, right? It's so cool. And it's weird, because I knew it was happening. Like, it's like a cognitive illusion, right? You can see the illusion, somebody can tell you the illusion, and it still works. You know, it's like putting a suit on, right? You know, you just feel different. So these competencies are not just about helping you get the next job. These competencies help you see your entire life differently, I would argue. And I think we need some evidence around that. But then, not only does your outlook change, opportunity changes. And I'll tell you a little story about this. Years ago, I picked up my daughter and her friend. And my daughter's maybe 13 at this time. And I've got this little Toyota Tercel. And my daughter and her friend jump in the back seat because they don't want to have any conversation with me. And that's fine, because I'm listening to the news or whatever. And so they're yakking away, and I drop off the friend, and Maya, my daughter, decides to stay in the back seat. I'm driving home, but at this point, it's not the news, it's Quirks and Quarks. It's a Saturday morning, and it's Bob McDonald interviewing this person who, here's a weird study, has captured, no kidding, captured 40 birds, male birds, of a certain species, and with these traps, and then took markers, like felt markers, you know, the kinds you use on a flip chart, and looked at these birds and had done an analysis of what made them look more male. Because, you know, the male is almost always more colorful in the bird world. So, you know, these bright blues or these bright crimsons. Well, they just took markers and made all these birds more crimson, more, you know, whatever the color was, to make them more male looking. Okay, so I think, well, that's a deeply weird fetish, but okay, I'm listening. And Maya, my daughter, she's got some book or something she's reading in the back, and I'm ignoring her, she's ignoring me, and we're driving home. And then this researcher releases these males out into the wild again, but has banded them all, and obviously they're colored differently, and somehow manages to recapture exactly the same 40 birds 2 weeks later, and measures their cortisol levels, their testosterone levels, their body mass, all that, and guess what? They have become more male. Think about this, folks. It's a shock and awe moment for the old guy driving. They have become more male in 2 weeks. Every marker of maleness, weight, muscle, all that has changed. And guess what? Birds don't know what color they are. They only know what color their friends are, right? They can't see themselves. So the only possible explanation is the rest of the bird world treated them differently, right? The rest of the bird world treated them differently. That kind of made them feel male. This is what I mean by opportunity effects. When you feel like you've got your act together, like you're skilled, like you can take things on, guess what? Everybody sees you differently. Your colleagues see you differently. Your bosses see you differently. Your supervisor sees you differently. Your client sees you differently. And guess what? You end up with different circumstances. You end up getting contracts that you might not have got. You end up getting promotions you might not have got. You end up getting sent to training that otherwise you wouldn't have been sent to, right? The actual structure of opportunity changes, just like these little birds became more male. By the way, when we get home and this episode's over and I park the car and turn the radio off, she goes, "See, I need those diesel genes. I'll be more feminine." My daughter's no dummy, right? But the other thing, and I don't know to put this under opportunity or outlook, but I think it does become under opportunity, is as you get more skilled and you get less worried about your own ability and anxiety around that goes away and you feel more comfortable taking care of yourself, these authors whose names always escape me, plus their difficult names out of Harvard, who wrote a book called Scarcity, Why Having So Little Means So Much, they talk about cognitive bandwidth and that when you're scarce of something, you lose cognitive bandwidth, right? So if you're desperately poor, you have no mental capacity to think about anything but being desperately poor. If you're desperately lonely, you have no mental capacity to think about relationships in any reasonable way. This is why you should never date somebody when you're desperately lonely. Been there. Oh, it ends badly, right? If you're really scarce of time, that's the worst time to make decisions about your time because you'll just make stupider ones, right, about time. And I think having a different outlook changes your cognitive bandwidth and allows you to see the world differently. There's a theory out there, again, for you positive psych folks, you'll know this better than I do, but Barbara Fredrickson has this theory called broaden and build. And it's this idea that if people feel good about themselves and they feel positive about themselves, et cetera, or animals for that matter, it's not a human-dependent thing, and they feel secure, they actually can see the world differently, right? They see the world more broadly. So as they're built up, their horizons broaden. And it's the same, right? If you're a little rabbit, right? And if you're kind of worried that you're about to die because some coyote's around the corner, you're always just looking right near you. Where can I escape? Where can I escape? But if you think you're in a secure environment, you can kind of look outward and go, oh, look at that pasture, look at all that grass, right? And you can go see it. And similarly with humans. I think that is part of this whole piece that allows, as you get career development competencies, you get to see the world differently and you get to see opportunities that have always been there, but you couldn't see them before. Now, I got a question for you. By the way, I hope nowhere did I ever advertise this was called a workshop, because that would be a big lie, wouldn't it? This is just Dave talking, I'm sorry. But here's a question. You folks are all career development people, and I already know almost every single person in this room has worked with more clients directly than I have, because I do very little direct work with clients. And I know there's something you're seeing, but you forgot this. Like, what's missing in this? As I've been talking to you, you've been going, well, where's X or where's Y? Or what about this effect? Is there anything obvious to you that's kind of missing in terms of when you think through the cycle of what happens to your clients, not only from a work point of view, but emotionally, skillfully, spiritually? Emily, and then Roberta.
Well, you're all talking about the individual, but we've all had phrases about a poor work environment. It's the collective group that is dysfunctional. It's a collective
Yeah,
group.
right, where you have a collective group that's dysfunctional,
Yeah.
and then everybody becomes dysfunctional, and it's incredibly hard to.
If that is reflected here.
Oh, thank you. You know what? Can't remember the author, but somebody back in 98 wrote this brilliant piece about a virtual cycle of organizational learning and change, and that was exactly the point, was figuring out what's the tipping point where you can get enough employees working in a proactive, positive way that eventually it sets up this kind of spiral of success that even not only negative employees can't pull down, the negative employees actually get pulled up by it, right? And that would be a cool thing to look at. That's all I know of, though, and I don't know of research around that. I just know there was this cool model. Yeah, thanks. Roberta, and then Serena.
I think this is very comprehensive. Like it's captured a particular case that I'm thinking of really well. The only thing I would hope for is that the CD intervention could be interspersed throughout. Like if you could find a way of connecting it all the way through, because I think, you know, when I've seen this work really, really well, it's when the career development practitioner doesn't have to let go as soon as
Right.
the person gets work, but can continue to check in and move through with them.
Have you been able to hear that? What Roberta's saying is take that gray career development thing and weave it into every other part, because in the best of all worlds, the career development practitioner doesn't abandon the client when they get work. They're helping them all the way along, and it kind of magnifies the whole effort, and I would agree. And it's interesting when you can find situations that happens. Yeah. Serena.
I suspect it might already be implied all the way through, but what strikes me is connection. That one of the most devastating losses when you're faced with mental illness is that sense of isolation and the loss of friends as they drift away, the loss of family relationships. And I think one of the effects of career development is a reconnecting effect. It reconnects you with community, with colleagues, with whatever outcomes, but it is a reconnecting effect.
Yeah. And I don't know if you were able to hear that, but just the power of reconnecting. Like as soon as you get work, or even the sense that you might get work, right? There's this, all that isolation that comes with mental illness has this hope of disappearing, which is fantastic. And I think I have an opportunity to talk about that a little bit more later.
And
Elaine.
related to that isolation with mental illness, but isolation of losing your job, and that whole set of
Right.
your network. And so this model is really, it speaks to the group effect when you do
Mm.
work with individuals and helping them to get those links.
Now, I don't know if you're able to hear that, but this notion of the group effect, right? Like, you know, it's interesting. I work with a lot of people who teach for me, because we do leadership work as well, are retired leaders. And it's so interesting, their experience with an organization for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and they leave it, and within a year, nobody from that organization is talking to them anymore. It's so interesting, right? And now, luckily, the people I know, like they've made friends outside, but man, if they hadn't, we'd have a big problem. Roberta, I think you had your hand up.
I agree with Roberta's statement about having that.
That's because she's named Roberta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have some experience working with individuals with mental illness, and I have one young lady in particular who just could not do anything, was scared in the crowd, and we took a chance on her and put her in, on ground,
Right.
And then she just went right back into herself, and then she's no longer in school now. And it's like starting all over again, and we've worked on this for like 3 years. My frustration with mental illness in our area is, like, I need to know who diagnoses this. We've got general practitioners, and these young people going in and saying, well, I'm really tired, you know, I'm kind of sad sometimes. You're suffering from depression. Here's a prescription.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to go along with that prescription. So it's a plan.
right.
So it's really frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
When it comes to working with.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's something else we were talking about at lunch is just, man, the prescription mentality and how the pharmaceuticals seem to be running the show, right? And yeah, you don't get support, you just get the label. And now, yeah, you look at what's happened. Thank you for that. Go ahead, and then we'll move on. And I've forgotten your name, sorry, but I know who you are.
And could that model incorporate maybe instead of unidirectional, could it not, move in the opposite direction? It may not be moving in that circular, linear.
Right. And that's where that genome project diagram is so lovely, right? Because it's just a big mess and it's all interconnected. But there are certain things that are stronger connections than others. Yeah, I just wrote that down because that's a problem. My problem with word art, actually. But yeah, but thank you. Go ahead, Gail. You see? Action, okay. Right. Well, and that's an interesting thing, right? Movement is a happy thing in career development, right? Because it's so much easier to change the direction of something that's moving than something that's stationary, right? So I think most of us, man, if we have a client moving, even if it's in the wrong direction, we go, okay, that's okay. We'll help them. Now, every once in a while, that can go wrong, right? You get movement and it's just set the person back. But 9 times out of 10, actually, it's not a bad idea. Thank you. All right. I know. Oh, where? Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Right. Now, well, and this is interesting, and you probably couldn't hear over there, but the comment was around, immigrants, people that are coming from a different language, having such difficulty picking up competence that'll work in our society and having to retrain and upgrade, et cetera. And that goes well beyond kind of career management competence. But it does get to this notion of how do you feel all these psychological well-being, social well-being things while you're in transition, say at school? Right, because there's kind of, and this is the other layer of complexity on all this. We have sort of what you could call chronic, chronic social cohesion and social meaning and purpose, and then we have like the episodic stuff, right? You got to be in a program for 2 years. You may hate the program, but it's taking you to where you want to go. Well, that's easier to do when you've got the wherewithal to see that where you want to go is where you want to go. But if you're just learning English because you just hope like crazy it's going to benefit you somehow, boy, that's a pretty contextual vacuum in which to keep yourself sustained. And your classmates are all in the same boat, so they can't quite be the support that classmates, for example, who are part of the society could be. I think it's ridiculously complicated with refugees, with immigrants, coming with a different language. And even actually with the same language sometimes, because then the social competencies take a while to learn as well. Thank you for that. I'll build something in. Now I realize I got to end in a few minutes. This this thing has 2 times on it, and I was looking at the wrong time. So anyway, I'm going to skip, because really the crux of it is, I'll get to in a moment, but the crux of it falls out of this diagram and tying it back to the flourishing model. So I'm going to skip this. You all know career development competencies, the blueprint for life work designs. There's other models out there. Savickas, I think, has what he calls meta-career competencies or career meta-competencies. We've talked about outlook effects. We've talked about, opportunity effects. And here's the punchline, I think. The punchline is, I think what I tried to do is take these different outlooks and split them out, right? So we've got an outlook about self that's changed when we're doing career development well, but also we see the world differently when we're doing career development well. We've got career literacy or career competence, the green piece of pie there. We've got opportunities that we see differently in the blue piece of pie, but we've also got opportunities actually changing for us because of the way we're behaving differently, just like those little birds, right? And then, of course, the gray one, we've got work. But career development isn't just about work, so don't ignore the word role, right? It's so different when you are in a role that you've chosen, that you've thought about, that you feel agency about, et cetera. It's a completely different experience than when you think you have to be in that role of being a parent or a spouse or a community volunteer or whatever it is, right? But if you've chosen it, and you've chosen it because you've got career development competencies and you've been strategic, it's different. And then I've just tried to kind of group, well, on the one side, on the external side, we have all these social well-being things that come right out of Corey Key's list, right? Social acceptance, social actualization, social contribution, coherence and integration. And then on the inside side, we have all the psychological well-being outcomes that he lists. And then overall, and I just put it at the bottom because I didn't know where else to put it, the whole idea of emotional well-being, right? If you can choose what you're doing, the role you're in, and you can do that strategically because you have the skills to do it, and you start seeing your world differently, all these outcomes radiate outwards, and I need a better graphic for it, but I hope you kind of get what I mean, right? Like, to me, this is, career development is a major player in mental health, and we don't have any good evidence. Well, I shouldn't say any, but we don't have great evidence on it, folks. And the one thing I'm going to have to short circuit is I did want to have a discussion at the end about, so what do we do about this, folks? Like, imagine if we could make the argument that we are major players in the mental health world, if somebody would just allow us to be, and see it. And if we could see it, and we could start demonstrating it and create evidence for it and start working on our own, but also with mental health professionals to really kind of work at this so that even if people have mental illness, they can still flourish. Because I don't know that we're ever going to get rid of mental illness ever, but certainly that won't be a career development priority. But, what if you have a mental illness and we still help you thrive? I think that'd be fantastic, and I think it increases your odds of making effective use of whatever mental illness treatment you're getting. It increases the odds of that working tremendously. So I'm going to stop there, except for this question. No. You're right. I forgot all about that. This is why I have a pen. Yeah. Oh, right, of course. And again, you know why I forgot it is I was looking at all this stuff on mental illness, and I thought, where's the stuff on kind of mental health, right? And so I've been really focused on mental health, but I'm glad you reminded me of that. Go ahead.
I just want to share, and don't throw things at me, working for the GOA, we do have the capabilities, and we connect with sociologists, psychologists,
Yeah.
And then we get that recommendation on if he or she is capable of working, and they demonstrate what kind of work is best suited for this clientele. So then we actually work in conjunction with that doctor, so that we can kind of tailor that opportunity. Now, these are few and far between, but the opportunity through the GOAs is quite costly, but we get that opportunity, and I, as a care planning counselor, get the opportunity to assess that individual. I'm trained in that in the
Mhm.
first step, and then it's sent off to that psychologist appointment instead. But
Right.
some of our individuals do head into the age perspective, but I do get some that indicate capable of working, need quiet places, repetitious jobs. So there are those capabilities and opportunities with those.
Yeah.
Maybe few and far between, but the government does offer some of those capabilities, and it's a win-win. It's a long term for me to invest in this individual, but the outcome is phenomenal.
Right. And you're talking inside the government, right? Yeah. Well, and there's a case in point of, man, if you have a good employer, look what you can do, right?
It is a phenomenal opportunity to work, and there are different programs out there we may recommend. I may have to hand off because my capabilities in my line of work may stop. But it's a progression of opportunities with this individual. It's not just when you get that doctor's or knowledge, then you have that. And I get clients that say, no wonder why I can't hold a job. And
Right.
I'm actually empowered to realize that there is something, maybe a head injury, maybe it's mental illness, and they are actually empowered to recognize what they're capable of doing. If there's not getting jobs, then why can't you hold a job here? Now we are creating there.
Yeah.
And some of them are so empowered and recognize their capabilities, they do succeed in a form of part-time, certain jobs,
Right.
4 hours a day, and that's all they can do.
Yeah.
And they're happy with that because they are given that knowledge and empowerment.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Good on the government of Alberta. Yeah, I like that. Anyway, I'm sorry I've gone over time. I thank you so much for putting up with my kind of learning as I go. And if you have any comments, by the way, let me just go, I did skip a couple of things. If you have any comments, thoughts, ideas, just email that address. Say, Dave, you don't know who I am, but I was at your talk, and here's what you need to think about. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.